morning session. We have here with us Ms. Park Soo-jin. She will be going through with us on genetic testing and the impact on insurance. Ms. Park is the Senior Manager for Underwriting Office and Innovation Asia based in Singapore for Swiss Re Singapore's office. And she has been leading and participating in the regional and global underwriting and product initiatives. She's also taking care of the governance of Asia underwriting community since she joined the regional role back in 2018. Soo-jin?
Yes, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's Soo-jin. Very nice to meet you. And yeah, as introduced, I came from the country which is well known for thyroid cancer claims and also the BTS, but I'm based in Singapore now. So I'm going to talk about the genetics today. So let me share my screen first. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yes, so today I'm going to talk about the genetic testing and its impact on insurance. I believe that this genetic testing topic has been under the spotlight for many years recently. And also, you may know that since the last month, the first moratorium in genetics underwriting became effective in Singapore. So I thought this might be the good timing for me to share this topic with you, and I hope it's interesting enough for you. So let's start. Yes, this is today's topic, today's agenda. So I will cover starting from the trends, and then I will touch on some of the regulations, especially around the predictive genetic testing in underwriting. And then we are going to touch on some of the thinking points on the impact of these changes. So let me straightly go to the background section. So what is the genetic testing? So are you familiar with it? Actually, there are multiple definitions in genetic testings. But in a nutshell, maybe I can say that the genetic testing looks for alterations in a person's genes or chromosomes to identify the heritable or acquired mutations related to a person's disease or health conditions. And there are quite many types of the genetic testing, but what you are seeing now is the most common types of the genetic testing. So we can have a look at it one by one quickly. So the first one is the diagnostic testing. So this is for identifying any specific genetic conditions in a symptomatic individuals. And usually it's happening in the medical centers or the hospitals. And the pharmacogenomic testing, actually it can be helpful to get the guidance on the individual's drug doses or the selection or the response on the drugs. So this can be the good source for reducing the side effect possibility, or it can be also helpful for the doctors to choose the treatment regimes sometimes. And the next one is the direct to consumer testing, DTC testing. And this is the area where you see a lot of the promotions and developments as well. But the definition itself is actually about any genetic testing which is not done by the healthcare professionals. So the scope of this DTC can be different depending on the country and their regulations. And the newborn screening, if you have kids, maybe you are familiar with this genetic testing, because nowadays in most of the developed countries, this newborn screening is kind of mandatory. Like they can detect some the inheritance diseases like congenital hypothyroidism or the cystic fibrosis. So it's commonly being used in for the newborns. And the next one is the predictive and pre-symptomatic testing. So this is actually the area that I'm going to mainly talk about, especially for the underwriting side. So usually this predictive testing is offered for the individuals who have the family history, but when they don't have any signs or symptoms yet. And Nutri genomic testing is about telling us like incompatibility or deficiency in nutrition for a certain individual. So this testing result can be helpful in managing their diet or nutrition relating to their health condition. And currently, many of the DTC testing kits are covering this nutrigenetic testing for giving some guidance on their health management to the customers. And lastly, the liquid biopsy testing is there. So this is also very emerging field in the medical world. And also it has a great impact to the insurance as well, especially around the cancer early detection. But this one is out of scope for my presentation today. So again, but today I'm going to maybe more focusing on the predictive genetic test, especially for the underwriting regulation. To continue to cover the trends and the backgrounds of this genetic test, let's see some trends in this genetic testing. You may know the very big project called the Human Genome Project, which started 1990 and ended in 2003. And actually the sequencing technology was used to analyze and map the human the genes. And this sequencing technology evolved a lot over the years. So new technology appeared more and more. And also one thing to notice here on the left side graph is that the cost, it dropped significantly. So if you look at 2008, the sequencing cost per genome was more than 1 million USD, but now it's close to $100 only. So it's really, really big change over the years. And if you look at the right side, the graph actually shows you how many genetic testings are available in the world now. And as of 2021, so there are more than 77,000 tests. This is a really big number. It's out of my expectation. And also, as you see in the graph, the number of these available tests were increasing continuously and significantly. So you can see that the genetic testing technology has been developed continuously, enormously, and the affordability also increased a lot. And then let me talk about the public awareness here. And when I talk about the public awareness, I cannot avoid to mention this lady, the Angelina Jolie. You may know that this lady actually had the preventive mastectomy in 2013, and she made it public. She opened it to the public through the New York Times article. And the background of that is that she had the cancer family history from her mother, and then she also got the predictive genetic test of the BRCA genes, which actually indicates high chance of having the breast cancer or the ovary cancer. So she wanted to reduce the probability of having cancer. So she took the surgery of removing her breast. And actually, there was an observational study in US to see whether there was any change in the public awareness after her opening to the public. And the study actually shows that the BRCA test number has increased a lot. So this red dot line shows the increased number of the BRCA tests in US. But actually, the number of the mastectomy case didn't increased, but at least we can clearly see that the public awareness has increased among those people who have some family history in the breast cancer and the ovary cancer. And also I want to share this one, that this is one of my favorite YouTube channel. This is very silly. And then a month ago, I found that they posted a video about their competition on the gene. And this is the promotion from the DTC company. What was surprising to me was that many of the comments from this video was very positive. So nobody talked about the worries about the privacy, or nobody worries about the accuracy of the test, but the people accept this DTC test quite positively. They are very open to do it, to understand themselves better. And also I was surprised by how the DTC companies are promoting themselves nowadays. So it's quite aggressive than any time before. So maybe this article is not surprising anymore. So many people are expecting that the DTC market will increase, will get bigger more and more. And actually we can still already observe it. So currently the largest DTC market in the world is US. So it occupies around the 42% of the global market, and the China is following. And also this article anticipates that some other markets in Asia will follow, like South Korea and India and Australia. So yeah, the DTC is actually the reading the area of the public awareness. So this is another example of the DTC. This is from the 23andMe company. You may heard of it because this 23andMe is one of the pioneers in this DTC market. Of course, if you look at the right side graph, you can see that the number of the customers increased a lot. So it means the expansion of the market itself. And also in this slide, what I also want to share and also wants to ask you to look at is the range of the genetic test that the 23andMe is offering. So they are offering something fun like ancestry or traits or the wellness, but also they provide some genetic tests which may have some medical implications, like genetic health risks for some certain diseases or the carrier status. But actually, each countries and their regulators have different stance on what can be done through the DTC screening test. So in US, it seems like the regulation is quite relaxed. So many of the many kinds of the tests can be done through the DTC, but in some countries like Korea or Singapore, yeah, some the clinical tests, the genetic tests are not allowed to do through the DTC test. But also we need to understand that this regulation doesn't go as they intended all the time, because like a 23andMe, many of the DTC companies are doing the international shipping. So even though, yeah, the Singaporeans cannot do this, for example, the carrier status testing in Singapore through the DTC, but if they want, they can do it through the DTC test kit from US. So it's outside of the regulation in a way. So that's the current status of the genetics landscape that we need to understand as well. And now let me talk about some insurance population as well. So C3 is doing the internal and external the genetic related surveys regularly to understand the trends and the landscape. And this is coming from our recent study. So in the survey, we asked whether what's the prevalence of the genetic test. So we asked whether the people had gone through any kinds of the genetic testing, and the answer rate was quite high than we expected. If you look at the USA, the 20% of the people in the survey said, yeah, they have an experience of getting the genetic test. In a way, it's quite natural numbers to see the highest number in US because as I mentioned earlier, the DTC market in US is the largest. So the exposure to the genetic test is high there. But if you look at the China or other countries, I feel the number is still quite high, right? So, and then we can also easily expect that these numbers will increase over and over. And another point that I want to mention is that through the survey, we also found that the genetic testing consumers tends to be highly educated and affluent men between age 20 to 40. And these demographics are actually matching with the insurance target age group and demographic group. So we can also expect that any changes or in the genetic testings or the increased public awareness on the genetic testing will directly impact to the insurance portfolio as well. And let me also briefly talk about how the insurance companies are currently accepting this genetic testing topic relating to their services and products. So I can say that the most common form of offering this genetic test in insurance is like a value-added service. So some companies are offering the nutrigenical testing or the pharmacogenomic testing as a value-added service for the existing policyholders. And usually I see that the response from the customers is positive. They are happy to know more about themselves in terms of the drug acceptance and also some nutritional information on themselves. So this is the most common form of offering the genetic test as an insurance service. But also we sometimes see the case like an insurance company offer the predictive and the pre-symptomatic genetic test as a value-added service for the insurance policyholders. But it may be a bit debatable, and also it may have some reputational risk sometimes, because if you look at the predictive genetic test, actually the validity of its test result, especially relating to the interpretation from the clinical perspective, is still doubtful in some labs or in some circumstances, especially if the country has a stance like they don't regulate the DTC companies who does this predictive genetic test diligently, then sometimes the test result is not really reliable. So we may mislead the consumers who gets this predictive genetic test with the lower level of the prediction power. And also in some places, including Korea, I also see that some of the salespeople use this predictive genetic testing as a marketing tool. So these sales agents actually make the potential customers go through the predictive genetic testing for free. And then if the genetic testing outcome says that, okay, this potential client has a higher chance of getting the cancer or heart attack or whatever, then the sales agent offer quite high sum assured of the cancer products or the CI products. But again, this can be related to the reputational risk. And even in these cases, my understanding is that the insurance company doesn't encourage the sales force to do it, actually. And also we saw a case like the product itself covers the predictive genetic test result by paying some small lump sum amount of money. It was from the online insurance, short-term online insurance from China, but maybe because of this reputational issue and some the credibility issue, I think this product disappeared quite right away, and that was the right decision from my view. Okay, then so we now have looked at the landscape a bit on what are the available genetic tests there and what's the applications in insurance world. And now I would like to talk about a bit more on the underwriting side. So what kind of the regulation is happening in terms of utilizing the genetic information. But before that, let me talk about the differences between the diagnostic genetic test and the predictive genetic test one more time, because this differentiation is really critical to understand this topic. So the diagnostic genetic test is to confirm or to rule out any suspected genetic disorder in a symptomatic individual. And usually there is no restrictions or the limitations in using this information in underwriting. But in reality, practically, the underwriters usually ask the name of the diagnosed disease, but we are not asking the name, we are not asking the name of the test. But anyway, there is no regulation or the restrictions in this area of the diagnostic genetic test. But the predictive genetic test is usually for asymptomatic individuals who doesn't have any symptoms at all. But usually doctors recommend this predictive genetic test for the people who have the family history to estimate any future onset risk of the disease, right? And the underwriting regulations are usually happening in this area, the predictive genetic test, and how the regulation looks like is very different depending on country. So this is how it looks, the regulation around how the insurers can use genetic data in underwriting. So very roughly, we can categorize them into three categories. So first one is no regulation or self-regulation. So for example, in India, there is no regulation and no agreed approach among the industry. So insurers may have different stance or approaches in genetics underwriting. But if you look at the Japan, yeah, also there is no regulation on genetics underwriting. But my understanding is that most of the insurers doesn't want to touch this topic, which is very complicated, and it also can link to the reputational risk again. So the most of the companies doesn't use the genetic information in their underwriting. But if you look at another category on the right side, this is a legal ban. So many countries are falling into this category, and many of the actually European countries are under this. So it means that these countries underwriters cannot use any predictive genetic information in underwriting. And the last category is limitation. So Singapore is under this category. So when I say limitations, it's actually about the financial limit. So for these countries, the predictive genetic test information can be used, but there is a designated financial limit. So only when the application sum assured exceeds that designated financial limit, the underwriters can use the testing exam result in underwriting. But one thing I also want to emphasize is that we clearly see the tendency towards increased regulation or the complete ban in the globe. So if you look at the countries in bold, like Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Canada, and China, actually all these companies' regulation or the stance has changed quite recently. So previously, all these countries' position was under the first category, no regulation or self-regulation. But the regulators or the governments actually encouraged or pushed the industry to make the moratorium or best practice, or the government itself actually made a new legislation to not to allow the insurance companies to use the predictive genetic test result in underwriting. So we can see that trends in the regulation field of the genetic underwriting. And let me also a little bit share on the limitation part a bit more in details. So I already mentioned that in terms of the limitation, the countries actually have a designated financial limit, right? And sometimes these limits were from the law basis, and in some countries, these financial limits are coming from the moratorium, right? So Australia, UK, Sweden, Hong Kong, Singapore, all they have now the moratorium. And these financial limits are usually different depending on the types of the risks that they are covering in terms of the financial limit number. And also one thing to understand is that these countries with the stars, like a UK and Hong Kong and Singapore, they have even more stricter limitation in genetics underwriting. So what it means is that these countries even have a highly predictive genetic test list approved by the regulator or the government. So what it means is that even though the sum assured of the application exceeded these financial limits, the underwriters can use that genetic information in underwriting only when that genetic test is included in the highly predictive genetic test list. So UK started that direction a few years ago. So UK list includes only one genetic test, which is Huntington's disease genetic test. And Hong Kong has a bit longer list, but the Singapore has relatively shorter list. So here is a bit of more details on it. So these are the countries where the genetic underwriting stance changed quite recently. So this is Australia, and their moratorium became effective in 2019. Yeah, and all these countries have the financial limit because they are all under the limitation category. But Australia doesn't have the list actually. So they only have the financial limit. But the Hong Kong one, which became effective last year, as I mentioned earlier, they have a long list. So the list actually covers breast cancer, ovary cancer, Huntington disease, Lynch syndrome, or the dementia or polycystic kidney syndrome. So they have quite a few diseases in the list. But if you look at the Singapore one, I think the Singapore moratorium is a little bit more complex than others. And the genetic test in the list is only a few. I will show you a bit later on the details of the Singapore situation. But also I would like to mention that there is an overarching principle here as well. So insurers actually shouldn't ask applicant to take the test, whether that's diagnostic genetic test or the predictive genetic test, for the purpose of getting the insurance. The applicants shouldn't be pushed by the insurer to take the risk. That's the actually general principle. And the second principle that we can observe in all these moratoriums and the best practice is that the test for the medical research is out of scope. So actually, this is very understanding principle if you understand the background of these moratoriums and the best practices. So the regulators and the governments actually push the industry or the encouraged to make this agreed approach within the industry, but that was mainly to protect the customers. The governments and the regulators know that the genetic test technology evolves a lot, and that also brings a lot of benefit to the population. So it's helpful in treatment, it's helpful to detect the diseases early, and also the people are more encouraged to manage their health status more actively. But also the government were worried about the situations like the people doesn't want to get the genetic test because of the worry about not being able to get the insurance cover because of their genetic test exam result. So that's why the moratoriums of best practices clearly states that the test for the biomedical research is out of scope, and the insurers shouldn't push the people to get the test for the insurance purposes. So that's the general direction of the regulations as well. And let me talk about the Singapore situation a little bit also. So this screen is coming from the Ministry of Health of Singapore. And around 2 years ago, the MOH actually published guidance to the public, and which actually explains very well about what's the difference between the clinical genetic testing and the non-clinical genetic testing. And intention of this guidance is to make the people understand better on this, because under the Singapore regulation and the legislation, all the clinical genetic testing should be done by the medical professional. So which means that the DTC test cannot touch this area. So this DTC testing is not managed by MOH. So the public should understand that the DTC testing result is not actually showing you that you have a certain disease or whatever. So the people shouldn't be misled by the DTC, the non-clinic genetic testing result. And also, as I mentioned earlier, even though the Singapore government doesn't allow the DTC company to touch the clinical genetic testing, still some Singaporeans can be exposed to the clinical genetic testing through the overseas DTC testing kits. So the Singapore government wants to make a clear awareness on these points to the public. And also Singapore government wanted to make the moratorium for the industry. So this is the outcome of the discussion between MOH and the industry of the life insurance. And the main idea of the Singapore moratorium is the double key model. The reason why we call it as double key model is that there are actually two keys, so two conditions. So in order to use the genetic information in underwriting, these two keys should meet. So the first key is about the financial limitation. And as you see, the financial limit is different depending on the risk types. And the second key is the list, so approved predictive genetic test. So only very highly predictable genetic tests can be included in this list. And MOH actually approves which tests can be included or not. So initially, the industry tried hard to include more tests in here, but actually the outcome is that we only have Huntington's disease and the BRCA1 and the BRCA2. And also, if you look at the table, actually these BRCA1 and 2 are allowed only for long-term care and CI and DI. So it means that, for example, if a person had the BRCA test result, a positive result, but if the person buys life insurance, then even though the sum assured is high enough, exceeding this 2 million Singapore dollar, the underwriters cannot use this BRCA test result in underwriting because this BRCA test is in the list for LTCCI DI only in this double key model. So it's a little bit tricky to understand, but the underwriters and also the risk assessors of the insurance should clearly understand what we can access to and what we cannot access to in insurance of Singapore in the Singapore context. So now my understanding is that the insurers in Singapore prepared or is preparing to accommodate this change in application process as well. So in case the application amount is exceeding these financial limits, then most of the insurance companies are going to ask additional question to find out whether the insured had this kind of the genetic test in the past or not. And lastly, in terms of the regulation, I also would like to mention about the family history, because the family history question can be a proxy of the genetic information, especially when the genetic information is not allowed to use in underwriting. But also we need to know that in some of the countries, the family history question itself is not allowed as well in insurance applications, like Japan, Taiwan, and some other European countries. But still, I think that the family history question can be a kind of the proxy as well. But also there is an aspect that these kind of the family history questions are usually a bit restrictive and very specific if you think about the wordings of it. So for example, we ask like, what's the family history of the two direct relatives relating to certain diseases like a cancer or diabetes. So it's quite restrictive. So definitely, even though we can ask the family history question, there is a gap in risk assessment. So again, for underwriters or the actuaries, I think it's important to understand how our family history question look like, and what's the regulation around that, and what's the gap from this, and what's also our capability in underwriting genetic information as well, together with this family history question topic. So now then I move on to the last part of which is about the impact of this genetic testing to insurance. So I mentioned earlier that the Swiss Re does some surveys on the genetic test. And from the recent study, recent survey, we found some positive aspects as well. So we found that the people who have the genetic testing experience motivate themselves to be a bit healthier. And also majority of the customers are quite willing to share their genetic information in case there is any exchange for the tangible benefit. So this might give us some rooms to think about the insurance proposition. But one thing surprising also is that the people who show the high disease risks have a clear intention to buy insurance more, right? So they show the quite a clear buying behavior, purchase behavior when they know that they are more prone to have a certain diseases. So it means that the insurance companies are exposed to the increased anti-selection risk. So from the same survey, we actually asked how much insurance do you want to buy more in case you have a high disease risk. And across those countries, we found quite consistent finding. So for the life insurance, these people are at high risk. These people shows that the 3 to 4 times more likely to buy life insurance. And if you look at the critical illness, and these people also show that 2 times to 5 times more likely to buy critical illness insurance. So it means that we are clearly exposed to the anti-selection risk. And actually, there are also available medical researches around this purchasing behavior. Some papers are about the life cover, some papers are about the LTC, and the cohorts were the people who have a certain genes like a BRCA or the Alzheimer or the Huntington's. But across those research papers, you can see that clearly higher anti-selection behavior. These numbers are also quite similar with what the Swiss Re found from our survey. So again, I think we really need to understand what's the customer behavior, and that also let us think about the necessity of monitoring these behaviors and trying to measure what's the impact from this anti-selective behavior together with the development of the genetic testing technologies. Yeah, so now it's the summary of my presentation. So I talked about the landscape of the genetic testing, and we saw that the affordability and availability significantly increased, and naturally the people's awareness has increased as well. So we really need to monitor it. And the regulatory pressure has increased a lot as well in all over the world. So we need to understand what we can do, what it cannot do, and what's the gap from there. Because of this regulation, clearly there is information asymmetry. So customers know their health condition more than us, but we cannot access to that information. So this will link to the anti-selection directly. So we need to understand what's the size of the risk. Ivan already told that it's really not easy to measure the risk, the future risk. It's not also difficult to measure it. There are a lot of the different factors that impacts to this topic, but we need to closely monitor what's the claims coming from this genetic test and what's the recent technologies, especially because the regulation is around the predictive genetic test. We need to see whether there's any new predictive genetic test which shows a great prediction power. Then we really need to try, for example, for Singapore and Hong Kong, we need to try to make those tests are included in the list of the moratorium. So we need to also monitor and act fast to prevent any adverse effect to the insurance. So that's it for my presentation. So I hope it was clear, but the time is almost up. Robin, maybe back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sujin, for the very detailed and a lot of new stuff to me on genetic testing as well. So I think we just, in interest of time, we just quickly run through the 3 questions that's on the Q&A board. So the first one we have is from Andy. With genetic testing becoming more and more common today and also in the future, people who know they are more likely to get cancer will buy insurance plan, while the genetic testing result will not be shared to insurers upon application. So based on your experience, what could insurers do or plan for preventing the anti-selection from this group of people?
Yes, that's very true. But when the regulation is very strong and when there is a clear legislation which bans the insurance company to use this information, actually in reality, sadly, there is nothing much we can do directly. But indirectly, maybe we also need to give the message to the public clearly what's the meaning of the genetic test, because currently most of the genetic tests that people are doing is DTC, and DTC cases, DTC cases are including some predictive genetic tests, which accuracy is not very high. So it can be also misleading to some people. So in the end, it's not very good for the people as well. So also, I just also mentioned that some insurance agents are using it in a not very good way. So in this case, the insurers also need to monitor how the salespeople are doing, and we need to take some actions when needed.
Okay. And we have a second question. I think that's swinging to another extreme end of the spectrum. So is underwriting allowed to ask, have you taken a genetic test and decline if the answer is yes, to avoid anti-selection risk?
No, I think this is not a very good practice to do. And if there is an moratorium or the best practice, I think also there is a kind of guideline on how we can ask the questions. So for example, in Singapore, we are saying that we only ask this kind of the question when the sum assured is exceeding, and we also limiting to the approved test. So this kind of the wider question is not very preferable, and also I think it's difficult to decline right away. It's I think it's not fair to the customers as well.
Okay, so just one last one. So is there anything special for prenatal or juvenile genetic testing, which is much more common than testing for adults?
Yeah, usually there is a screening test more recommended for the prenatal or the newborns, and then they are usually about the congenital genetic test, congenital genetic diseases which may need some early intervention. So the most of the governments also have the list of these genetic tests which can be recommended to these age groups.
Okay, great. I guess maybe in the future everyone will just try take a test on that, whether to do the genetic testing, but whether release or not, we don't really have any controls. It's up. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sujin, for the very informative session.